All right, so, and again, if you haven't been before, the structure is pretty straightforward. These guys are going to talk for 20 or 30 minutes, entirely up to them. They're both quite shy. They don't usually like to talk too much. Steve in particular might need some encouragement. And then when they've finished, we'll throw it open to question and answer. So a good opportunity to interview the interviewers. And I think they're comfortable talking as much about current politics as they are about current fiction. And I'm certainly keen to explore the overlap between fiction and reality. Okay, so I'm not quite sure who's going to open the bowling. Chris is. So I'm sure most of you recognise our two speakers tonight, but Chris Uhlmann from the ABC and Steve Lewis, formerly of so many mastheads, but how do we describe you now? Raconteur.
Raconteur.
Author. Well, I was going to end with author.
Escaped convict. Consultant. Freelance journalist.
Yeah, you should be scared. Consultant and freelancer. But
I'm a sidekick to him, that's all.
Steve Lewis, formerly of Fairfax and News Limited. Chris, very long term of ABC, including, how long since you were on breakfast radio here, Chris?
10 years since I've been
10 years, wow. Oh, well, that's how long I've been in Canberra then. So without any further ado, I'll hand over to Chris, and then he's going to hand over to Steve, and then we'll hand over to you guys. You go first.
Yes, Well, Richard, thanks very much for having us, first of all, and thank you to the Australia Institute, and thanks everyone for coming along. I remember the first time I thought that there were stories that didn't get told in politics that would be worth telling people about, and wondered how you might go about it. It was in 1991. Bob Hawke was Prime Minister of Australia, Paul Keating was the Treasurer, and I was at a news conference at the Canberra Times when I worked then, and the Chief of Staff decided that the people of Australia really needed to know that Paul Keating was actually a wealthy man, because he owned not one, but two houses. One in Sydney and one in Canberra. So the genius idea that he had, and this is how these ideas always would begin, was that they would take a photograph of the Sydney house and of the Canberra house, and that they would then put them both on the front page. Now, even in those simpler times, you could have got away with that story and the Treasurer would have been annoyed, but they did something that was a huge security breach, because out the front they had the Canberra house. They named the street, and you could clearly see the number on the letterbox. So they'd given away the residential address of the Treasurer of Australia. So at about 9 o'clock that day, the day that story was published, and in those days, those happier times, you could shoot a cannon in a newsroom and not hit anyone at 9 o'clock in the morning because journalists were not there, except for Graham Downey, who was the consumer affairs writer at the Canberra Times, and he always came in on the same bus because Graham is blind. So Graham catches his bus in, he's walking into the newsroom at the Canberra Times, tapping his way past the Chief of Staff's desk, and the phone is ringing, and Graham cannot leave a phone unanswered, so he picks it up, and on the other end of the phone is an absolutely enraged Treasurer. And here I'll have to edit just a little bit of what Paul Keating said, but it went something along these lines. "You effing pack of effing C's! You complete pack of effing C's! Do you know what we've done?" And Downey said, "What have we done?" And Keating said, "Have you seen the front page of your newspaper this morning?" And Downey says, "No." He said, What do you do there?" He said, "I'm a journalist." He said, "Journalist? Call yourself an effing journalist? What kind of dumb effing C journalist hasn't seen the front page of their own newspaper this morning? Why haven't you seen it?" And Downey said, "I'm blind." And Keating said, there was a pause. And then Keating said, "Well, get me someone who can see."
Good
anecdote. Now that story ricocheted, Steve never heard that. That story ricocheted around Australia, behind the scenes. Journalists around the country knew that story, tell that story to this day. It got all the way up to Packer, who owned the newspaper at that stage, who thought it was hilarious. And even the photographers who thought it was so funny decided they'd play a trick on a young cadet photographer called Julio, who hadn't been there that day and of course didn't read his own newspaper and didn't know about the story. When he came in the next day, there was a post-it note on his desk which said, "Julio, when you come in in the morning, could you ring the Treasurer's office and ask him if you can get a photograph of him watering his garden?" Well, Julio worked for the Canberra Times. It's not an unusual request for him to have to do something like that. So he rang the Treasurer's office. Gets onto the Treasurer's EA. Treasurer's EA knows the story. Everybody in Canberra knows the story except for Julio. And she says, and it's explained to her, she says, "Hold, please." And to my knowledge, it's the first time in the history of Australia that a cadet photographer has ever been put straight through to the Treasurer of Australia, who said something along the lines of, "You come anywhere near my effing house and I'll rip your effing head off, right?" And so I thought, this people need to know these stories, but these aren't the sorts of stories we normally publish in newspapers. So boiling away in the back of my mind for a very long time, since 1991 in fact, is the idea that we should perhaps write some of these things down. Steve, of course, comes at it from a different path.
Thank you very much, Chris. I haven't heard that anecdote. It's refreshingly
New.
New. That's a great anecdote. So, look, Chris and I, in about April 2011, we were mates. Chris was working at the ABC. I was working at News Limited, the hate media, and it was. We thought, what an opportunity for the hate and the love media to sort of join forces, perhaps, and write a novel. We basically came up with an idea. While having coffee one morning in Deakin, that Canberra was a great location for political drama. Chris and I had spent about 40 years combined in the cauldron of the press gallery, reporting politics, and there was a huge amount that you couldn't report. And we thought, just turn that on.
Yeah, turn it on, mate.
Oh, sorry.
That's why he's not a broadcaster.
Yeah. I was a drummer.
They say always a drummer.
How many drummers does it take to change a light bulb? 1, 2, 3. What do you call a drummer whose girlfriend's left him? Homeless. Yeah. I'm used to these sorts of jokes.
Ian and Verona, there's some seats up the front here. They want to be able to walk out.
We've got royalty. I didn't realise that. So Chris and I had spent a long time working in the press gallery, writing and reporting politics, living and breathing the press gallery and Parliament, and that's how we met people like Richard and Ben and Ian Verona and others. We thought Canberra was a great location for political drama, for political novel. One morning we were having coffee and we basically stumbled upon this idea. Chris started talking about this idea that he had swirling around in his head for essentially a sort of political satire, which involved a former Prime Minister,
now Foreign
Minister,
with a dicky heart.
Who
had a stroke on Maitline.
Yeah, and
basically the rest of the book in a coma.
Became paralysed. But of course, he was a she, Katrina Bailey. And from that, this idea grew that we would write a novel, which we did. We wrote The Marmalade Files a couple of years ago, and that was the precursor to the Mandarin Code, which has been out for a couple of months, and essentially that we'd love to talk to you about tonight. Talk to you about the idea of basically trying to make Canberra a location for political drama, because we see so much drama here. Canberra is a great city of intrigue and subterfuge and drama that happens all the time, and anybody who works in the sort of political sphere knows that. Anybody who works in the diplomatic community knows that there are, at least one spy to every embassy in Canberra, and yet so much of that doesn't get reported. And to the outside world, most of whom don't understand how Canberra works, and sees Canberra as a reasonably sort of bland city, although I would argue that that approach is changing, or that perception is changing. They don't really understand, how Canberra operates. So we've sort of grown up with British political drama and American political drama and even Scandinavian political drama. Borgen, which I think is a wonderful, wonderful series about a Danish Prime Minister. And Chris and I thought, why can't we do that in Australia? Let's give it a go. And so that's essentially what really motivated us from the get-go, to basically see if we could, do something, see if we could basically take our ideas and turn that into a political novel, which was Marmalade Files. And then we came up with the Mandarin Code.
That's right. And with the first book, obviously, we wanted to write it as close to the bone as we possibly could, so that we could write about some of the things that we didn't normally write about in our day job. And then, of course, we came up with a few issues with lawyers. In fact, we had not one, but 2 lawyers look over the first book. And we gave them a list of, I think it was 14 people who might think that they appeared in our book. And some of that was solved by the fact, so one of the characters is a former Prime Minister who'd been deposed by her party, who is now Foreign Minister, pathological Mandarin speaking Foreign Minister, but female. So that was taken care of. Because in Australia, you can be sued. If someone says that they recognise themselves in a work of fiction, you can still be sued by them if they can establish that. So there were, it is all fiction, of course, but there are a number of gender switches in it. But we came up against one particular problem. We had a meeting with our two lawyers and HarperCollins one day, where the lawyer said, look, I've read the book. I think we're all right now on most fronts, but there's this one character, the Defence Minister, who has an affair with a Chinese spy, essentially. Labor, I've got a bit of an issue with that. I don't think that we're going to be able to get away with that character, so you're going to have to change him. Could you make him or her? No, it's not going to work. Defence Minister, and for the rest of the book, it doesn't fit. And so we were brainstorming, and I said, well, what if we gave him a disability? What, for example, if he was in a wheelchair? And the lawyer's face lit up and said, that would be fantastic. Could you put them in a wheelchair? They said, no, actually, there's a sex scene that involves that person. And we're having a hard enough time writing that without trying to work out how you do that in a wheelchair. And then we thought, well, he'd been in the CFMEU. What if he had had an industrial accident and lost a hand? And the lawyer said, that would work. And then we thought, well, what if he replaced the hand, to be menacing because he's in the CFMEU, with a hook? And that became his trademark. And the lawyer said, that's fantastic. And that's why the hook is in the book. Is that right? Yeah.
And so we put out Marmalade Files a couple of years ago, and it was quite well received. At the same time as we did that, we also had an idea that we wanted to see if we could develop these books for television, either as a film or as a miniseries. So we approached. In fact, before the first book was out, we spoke to Penny Chapman. We rang Penny Chapman up. Now, anybody who knows anything about Australian TV production knows that Penny is one of the doyens of Australian TV. She's one of the principals of Matchbox Pictures. Devil's Playground, which is on Foxtel at present, is Matchbox. They did The Straits, they did The Slap. Penny years ago did Brides of Christ. She's got a wonderful track record. Unbeknownst to us, Penny was also a graduate of the ANU. She grew up at Braidwood, and she'd long harboured a ambition to do a political thriller based in Canberra. So when we rang out of the blue and said, look, we've got this idea to write this sort of political novel, and we'd like to see if it's got potential to be turned into something for film or for TV, Penny was really interested. So we spent the last 3 years or so basically working with Penny and with Matchbox to try and develop these books into a miniseries. And a couple of months ago, when we brought out the Mandarin Code, Screen Australia was announced that they were going to fund or finance a 6-part miniseries. So that's in development. That's a joint venture between Matchbox and Foxtel, and we're really looking forward to it. The plan will be to film next year in Canberra, and it will be, we've got the Code that's playing at present. I don't know how many of you have seen the Code. I think it's a very good TV series. It's probably the first TV drama that's been written where Canberra is a central character. And that's essentially what we're trying to do. We're trying to make Canberra an absolute central character in our books, and hopefully in the miniseries if and when it comes to screen. Because Canberra is just a great location. It's a great physical location, but there are some great stories. There are some great themes that emerge from the city, and that's what we were trying to explore with these books.
Yeah, in both of the books. And what we want to do, first and foremost, we wanted to write something that was fun. There are plenty of people in Canberra who work in the jobs that we work in who do fact-based books. We wanted to do something that was really good fun, but did actually deal with some of the main issues, and particularly after the 6 years that we've just been through, we wanted to deal with leadership. We wanted to deal with a hung parliament. We wanted to deal with the kinds of circumstances that politicians find themselves in, where, in fact, They are wanting to do the right thing, but circumstances force them to do something different. And that's actually extremely difficult. So although people have said that some of the characters or the book is dark or is a bit too savage in some parts, I think that there are characters in there that come out as being perfectly decent people who are trying to do the best they possibly could do in very difficult circumstances. I don't think people actually realise how tough a job that is to do. I've always said there are two professions that everyone thinks they can do better than the incumbents. One is politics, the other is journalism. I think it's absolutely true. You don't normally say to a brain surgeon, I could do that better than you. But you could do it if you were a politician. So we want to deal with those issues. We also wanted to deal with some of the big issues that Australia was facing, and key among those was the fact that we're in a really interesting time because our major economic partner is now no longer a liberal democracy, and that's the first time in Australia's history as a nation that has been the case. And so we have a key ally in the United States that's a liberal democracy, and we have China now as our major economic partner, and that creates a tension. Now, you ask any politician in Canberra from either of the major parties whether or not that's going to be a problem, and they'll say no. We don't have to make a choice between China and the United States. We think that this is something that we can manage. The Chinese will understand. We've had this long-standing alliance with the United States. Well, we took the view, well, this is fiction, so why don't we take reality, which is this exists, and then just amp it up a bit. And that's certainly where we go to in the Mandarin Code. We would start to imagine a circumstance where there was a more nationalistic US government. So in this case, a Republican takes over. And in China, at exactly the same time, because this is what happened a year or so ago, exactly the same time, you have a changeover in the Standing Committee, and they are more nationalistic. So these two powers are on a collision course, and the Australian Prime Minister is caught in between. Now, as we were writing this, we thought, okay, this is a work of fiction, and we based a lot of stuff around the Senkaku Islands and what would happen if China became more aggressive about that, and Japan, of course, which has ownership of the islands at the moment. And then, as we were writing, these things started to happen. There were real issues between Japan and China, and this year in particular, we've seen a far more aggressive China in pushing its elbows out into the region, which is the premise of the book. Now, it doesn't mean that there's going to be a conflict or a regional war, but it does mean that the themes that we're dealing with, I think, are quite contemporary.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah, we wanted to, as Chris said, we wanted to basically look at that, I guess, the challenge that Australia faces between how does it balance its relationship with America against that of China. I mean, it's a fascinating issue where supposedly going to sign a free trade agreement with China, and at the same time, of course, America is our closest and most important strategic ally, and so and we know that America and China have been quite aggressive towards each other, particularly over issues like the Senkaku Islands. So it does raise a raft of issues. At the same time as we were researching and writing this book, we also had really good scenarios playing out in Canberra. For instance, we had the new Chinese embassy being built, or the new Chinese annex that was being built. I don't know how many of you walked past it. I mean, it was, when I first came across it, I had no idea what it was. It was down by the lake, it was a 8-foot colour-bond fence. Free medicine. Razor wire right round it with CCTV cameras everywhere. And you thought, what the hell is this? I mean, what is it? And then I think the ABC was the first to start doing some stories on it, because the local CFMEU tried to get access to the site. They said, well, if you're putting up a building here, we want to basically come and make sure that the building standards are based on Australian standards. And they were told, fuck off, basically. It was a black site because the Australian government and the Chinese government basically signed a deal. So all of the people brought in to build that embassy were Chinese nationals. They brought in on diplomatic visas. It was a black site. The ACT building inspector, Mark McCabe, whose job it is to go around and tick off on every single building built in Canberra to make sure that they are of Australian standards. And it's a serious issue. A lot of construction workers have been killed in Canberra over the past decade or so because they've been flawed or faulty construction. So these are really serious issues. But Mark McCabe, again, was not given access to that site. And
is there asbestos in it?
We don't know. But again, this was happening, and I was working for New Zealand at the time, and there's a great story emerged a few years ago where very Canberra story, where we had the Hot Air Balloon Festival a couple of years ago, and I don't know if you remember, but probably back 2012, they had a Darth Vader balloon. So one of the News Limited snappers, a guy called Gary Ramage, who's a great photographer, was asked by the Brains Trust in Sydney to go up and take a photo of Darth Vader. So Ramo gets all his camera gear and he's going up in a hot air balloon trying to find Darth Vader. And he's floating across Canberra and he just happens by chance to float across the Chinese embassy. So he just takes some photos, doesn't think anything of it. And then a month or two later, I think, Four Corners had the program. I don't know if you recall it. Four Corners had a great program about alleged Chinese cyber espionage in Canberra. You know, they supposedly stole the building plans for the new ASIO building and all that sort of stuff. There's this great story about alleged China eavesdropping. Anyway, Ramo knew that I was interested in the story, and he said, "Oh man, I took some photos of the embassy, which had been sitting in his file for about a month." So he showed them to me, and they were absolutely gold. They showed these building workers building this deep trench and laying this pipe. And I showed it to a few people, including the local head of the CFMEU, Dean Hall, who features in the book. And I said, "Mate, you know, what's going on here?" And people I showed it to said, "They are breaching every single building standard in Australia." It was a deep trench. It was over head high, and there was absolutely no reinforcement, and which of course is a breach of the Australian building standards. So we basically sort of had this sort of great story that we sort of had by chance, but we ended up working it into the Mandarin Code. We sort of thought it was great material. What if you sort of took that and, as Chris said, just sort of amped it up a little bit and basically ran a fictitious story about it? And that's essentially how we started the Mandarin Code. That's how the novel starts.
And the hilarious thing too is that some of the things that people imagine must be fiction in the book are the things that are absolutely accurate, because so many weird things. So in the first book we thought we wanted to have a security analyst who was a transgender woman. And when one of the reviews came out on the first book, it said, "Oh, this is such..." It was actually not a very nice review, frankly. And it said, "Oh, this is so thinly disguised as this person is that person, that person is this person. But the thing that pings this book as being fiction is the idea that you could have a security analyst in the Defence Signals Directorate who is a cross-dresser." Well, of course, that person exists. And her name is Stephanie, and she really liked the book. Then there was we have a scene in the second book where we have inside Fort Meade, Maryland, in the NSC, you know, the hub of national security in the United States. And we describe the Information Dominance Centre. And we describe it this way, that it is built based on the USS Enterprise, that is the one from Star Trek. The bridge of it, that you would all be familiar with if you saw that, where it goes whiz when the door opens and there's a big chair and then there's... And that the person who ran the Information Dominance Centre, the person who ran Fort Meade and the NSC and Cyber Command in the United States, his parking space at Fort Meade in Maryland is 007. All of that's true. It was based on an article that appeared in the Financial Review on the outgoing head of the NSC, and he thought, well, look, you know, if we want to encourage people that are working in a new era of cyber warfare, so they actually got imagination, which designs Hollywood movies, to build the internals, to design the Information Dominance Centre at Fort Meade in Maryland. So there are lots of things in the book where we, again, it's hard for sometimes people to believe that these things are actually happening in the real world, but they are. Almost some of the best things that are in the book are things that have actually happened. And one of the other scenarios we wanted to build was the idea at the end, in a sign that the United States and China were really coming to blows, was to have a carrier strike group sail through the Taiwan Straits. Hasn't been done since 1996, when the Nimitz and one of the other aircraft carriers was sent through there by Bill Clinton, when there were threats of missile testing across the Taiwan Straits. Now, everybody we spoke to in Australia, and that included 2 admirals and 1 former chief of the Defence Force, said that would never happen. That is not going to happen nowadays. And we said, well, look, we don't, it's fiction. So that's going to be our scenario. So it's going to happen in a fictional book. Could you just help us describe how that would work? They refused to do it because they didn't believe the premise. Finally, through an Australian consulate official in Hawaii, we got onto a former commander of the US Pacific Fleet, Zat is his nickname, Zlatovar, and got in touch with him, and he said, yeah, that could happen. I was the last one to order that to happen through the Taiwan Straits. And if America wants to project its power and show the world that, you know, it is still a powerful thing, as much as they've worked on these area denial weapons, that the United States might contemplate that.
We might throw it open to questions. If people have got any questions they'd like to throw at us, we'd be very happy to answer them as best we can.
Oh, great. I'm going to ask the first question, and I guess it's to both of you. I mean, there's a classic question of is fiction or non-fiction the best way to help people understand the world? Well, you guys, it's been your job to report on, analyse, and comment on the facts of what is or is purported to happen in Canberra. I don't think it's an irony that you switched to fiction, but do you think that it's... No, I don't. I just think you can wear two hats. I don't think that's a problem at all. But do you think that the way that politicians, and I guess anyone in public life these days, works so hard to control the public perception of them, do you think that actually fiction makes it kind of easier to explore big important issues and themes rather than, a sit-down interview with the Prime Minister, who is skilled, all of them, skilled in the art of ignoring hypotheticals to give someone a sense of, but what if, or...
I think it certainly makes for a more entertaining read, maybe most of the time anyway. Look, I think that's right. I think that much of the really, really good political drama that we've seen emerge over the past, that State of Play and even things like The Thick of It, which are very, very heavily satirical, which I love. For anyone who's sort of worked in the area, they know that it's very, very close to the bone. So I guess the best satire or the best thriller is stuff that's just that little bit removed from actual reality. And I think that you do get that opportunity to, you do get the opportunity with novels at least to basically sort of develop themes and to write about serious issues, which, as Chris said, we've tried to do with these books, is actually talk about the dynamic, the interplay between politicians, between journalism, where the media is going, the whole relationship between Australia, China, America, and that. So it certainly offers you a different perspective and a different dynamic, and you're able to basically sort of write in a way that if you're writing, like Paul Kelly, whose excellent book Triumph and Demise is out at present. I mean, he just wouldn't be able to cover off on these subjects in the way that we've been able to do, because essentially we've had the luxury of being able to amp them up.
Yeah, and the other thing too is that some of the things that happen are funny, and I just think that it helps the fact we never, it upsets Steve when I say this, it's not literature. We set out to write, I said to my brother who writes literature, he writes very good literature, no one's ever published it, but it's fabulous. And I said to him, if I ever write a book, I don't want it to be an airport novel, I want people to buy it and enjoy it.
Well, people have said it's unkindly that it's dickhead literature.
In fact, there might be a person who christened it Dickhead Lit.
No, where?
Oh. Because sometimes your friends are really unkind.
Our publisher gets Anna, who's works for HarperCollins. She says, "Oh no, you don't have to. It's it could be literature. It doesn't have to be sort of Tolstoy or whatever." But yeah, no, we it's fast paced.
And just one quick one from me, because I can't believe this is true. Do you guys really both still maintain that you'd never heard of the meditation room until you wrote this book? Because you've both been in Canberra long enough that I can't believe that was...
I had heard of it.
Meditation
room. Wow.
Figures in the book you have to buy.
I'll try.
Told you I'd have to kill you. Meditation, come on mate, you tell
meditation room, and it's been famous for quite some time. And in fact, the thing that's great about it, we got more help from politicians and chiefs of staff, spooks, doing this, telling us real stories than we ever have when we ring them up and say, could you help us with one of the And so we had a chief of staff who cannot be named, saying that we had to work the meditation room, and we did know about it, right? So we did a lot of research for this book, not carrying it to the nth degree, but we went back into the meditation room, which is, so if you're in between the House of Representatives and the Senate inside Parliament House, there is that big marble area where there is a fountain in the middle which reflects the flag above it. The idea the architect had was that when members and senators gathered in this space, the trickling sound of the water would mean that you couldn't overhear their conversations. I have never seen them talking there. Like, the things that architects imagine and the things that actually imagine are two way different things. But anyway, but there is that area. But on the Senate side, so if you're going towards the Senate doors, there's a lift just to the left-hand side of the Senate doors. And if you go into it, it has M written on it. It's the only one that has a mezzanine floor. You get out on the mezzanine floor and there's this small prayer room which has been set up, non-denominational of course, Australia being Australia. There's even, I don't know if they've moved it, but there's still even an arrow pointing to Mecca. Maybe someone got in and turned it round recently. But in any event, but there are unfortunate stains on the couches. You can go and see for yourself, there are there. And anyway, we had this chief of staff telling us that...
Coffee stains?
Chief of staff telling us that when she was working on the Senate side of Parliament House, there was in fact a ring of young staffers who during question time used to repair to the... because they knew their bosses were going to be busy. And they weren't working on policy.
Didn't they close it down?
No, it's still
still
there.
there.
Yeah,
The ring.
There was a ring.
they did shut the ring down, yeah.
I think the ring closed itself down.
I'm going to nip this one in the bud. Okay, there's a question at the back.
Thank you very much. Extremely entertaining.
Just hold on one sec. I might swap you a roving mic for that
Yeah,
one.
good idea. That's right.
Thank you. There are two of you. Usually, authors are not happy working together. So books have one author. How did you manage having two authors? Did you write a chapter each? 1, 3, 5? Or did you edit the other person's writing? I'd like to see a play written by two authors. I've never seen a play written by two authors, but I think a lot of films have many scriptwriters.
Yeah. There are 6. There's one on each episode of whatever they're going to call Secret City.
No, after you.
After you.
No, no. What do we do? We'll
That's
do
exactly
we.
Steve writes the adjectives. No, with the first one kind of just poured out of us because it was kind of, if you like, there were 2 books. I was wanting to do satire, Steve was wanting to do a thriller, and we combined the 2 of them. But we did work on each other's stuff, and in the end we say, and it's true, every word is shared because down to the point of having, once we got all the way through, and the process was, we write a really detailed synopsis. Then we write down what chapters we think we're going to need, and we write a synopsis for each one of those, and then we try and work out how they're going to fit in together, and then we sometimes split the work up, and then we sometimes share the work and write together. Steve lives in Sydney, I live in Canberra. We'd work via Skype, so most times that we were writing together. We went down the south coast. Once we'd finished the whole thing, then we'd go down to the south coast. We've done this both times, spend a week in each other's company and read the book out aloud from beginning to end, which when we got to the sex scene was awkward. Because it was one of those, and there were 2 sex
We don't
scenes.
call them sex scenes.
That's
Clinical erotic.
That's
Just
right.
get it right.
But in the first book there were 2, and as I say, we both had a crack. And it was the Annabelle Crabb amused herself immensely at the launch of our first book, where she had people vote on which sex scene she thought each of us had written. And she was tremendously amused by the idea that we would have written the word panties for women's undergarments. Because apparently, and look, I've been out of the game since the 1970s, really, but apparently panties are not in common use anymore. And as I said to her afterwards, well, how do you have visible panty line then? Well, so figure out.
Take that.
But then in the second book, we decided, because as we went out for the first book, we kept coming across mountains of 50 Shades of Grey. Everywhere we went, there'd be 4 of our books with signs, and there'd be 7,000 copies of 50 Shades of Grey, and women sort of going backwards and forwards between this pile as it got ever smaller. And I said to Steve after we went to the 5th book, that's it, next book, we're doing a bondage scene. And we did.
Does that sort of, yeah. I look, and the second book we spent a lot more time researching it, and a lot more time. We really sort of developed the plot line, and look, we work well together, and particularly I guess probably the last third of this book, we literally sort of sat down and just wrote it, and it is give and take. You got to basically be prepared to park your ego at the door and be prepared to compromise. And we also have a wonderful, we've had a great editor, Amanda, who's edited both books, and that's absolutely critical because she can smooth out some of the rougher passages that Chris and I allow or write. So that's really important.
Just grab your mic.
Hi, at the risk of being too serious, I'd like to ask why you're so down on the Greens. So, in the Marmalade Files, you have a foie gras and champagne guzzling Greens leader who claims to be a vegetarian. And you refer
Based
to the
on Ben
Greens.
Oquist.
Oh, yeah. Clearly. And you refer to the Greens as inner city Wingeratis, which I just think is a gross libel, frankly, because the Greens have some really positive and productive policies. They're not just useless whingers, they're people with some really good ideas, even if they are, like me, overly serious.
Well, one of the things, I'd say that every single party in the book cops it, and one of the things I find about the Greens is an inability to laugh at themselves, and so we thought we would. But we've also laughed at journalism and laughed at the Labor Party and the coalition through the course of two books. So it was, and one of the things I thought too is that people don't make fun of the Greens, and so why didn't we? So, I'm
not sure that we made, we sort of, to the extent that we could be nuanced in both books, we have tried to be. I mean, I don't think for instance, journalists come out of either book all that well, and both of us, spent most of our working lives as journalists. So, the idea wasn't to sort of basically pick on one political party or one section of society or another. But I mean, the first book is more satirical than the second book is as well. And you've got to, you've got to have, Chris
second book, the leader of the coalition gets caught in a bondage session with a journalist. So that's not exactly kind to the Liberal Party. And the first book, the Labor Party, really cops it. So I didn't think we did one chapter.
I've heard suggestions that former senior Labor MPs have privately suggested that aspects of the Marmalade Files were written about them, and not too pleased about it.
No, there've been a couple that weren't pleased. The former Prime Minister.
Yeah.
Probably more concerned that people felt they were left out of it.
Yeah. I was doing a documentary just inside these four walls. I'm sure no one can spread this story. But I was working on the ABC's documentary on the sort of Labour in power thing that happens, and we were in negotiations with Kevin Rudd and Julia Gillard. And it was proving extremely difficult to get to meet or have any kind of conversation with Kevin Rudd. And I thought it might be me. And so we dispatched the managing director, who went to see him, and he rang me and said, "Yeah, it's you." And in the fourth paragraph of his dissertation on your faults, he said, "And that effing book, that's just an attack on me." So I rang Steve and I said, "You read the book?"
And you liked it.
You just wish there was an index. Next.
So you said it was going to be turned into a 6-part series. Do you have any say over the actors, and do you have any preferences for who should play who?
Who plays Richard Dennis?
Where is the bald think tank boss? Yeah.
He'll play himself in a very important cameo. The short answer is no, you don't have much say. So we sold the rights or assigned the rights to Matchbox, and they develop it with their own script writers, and we sort of, I guess, we get brought in. We sort of consult, but we don't have a lot of say. I mean, for instance, they have changed the gender of our protagonist from male to female, and very sensible. Well, Yeah, but yeah,
Does that
like,
take it back to defamatory again?
oh,
No,
might
it's
do.
the journalist, yeah.
Oh,
It's the
might do
journalist.
actually.
Harry Dunkley becomes Harriet.
Yeah. So they rang us up and said, look, what do you think about this?
Journalist.
Oh, that's funny.
Can't defame journalists. Till Andrew Bolt that. Yeah. So you don't sort of you do lose that sort of control. But look, with the casting they do quite late. I mean, they're still developing the scripts, and but hopefully, given the budget they've got to work with, which is quite a sizable budget, they'll be able to attract a strong cast. That hopefully a really good, strong Australian cast.
Did you have a question?
I do have a question.
You were talking a little bit about what's real and what's not real, and everyone says that the truth is stranger than fiction. And is that true when you're writing a novel? Are the strangest and most far-fetched parts of the book largely based on truth? And I was thinking about this because I look mainly at infrastructure and coal mines in my work at the Australia Institute, and I was watching Utopia on the ABC recently, and I don't think there was anything in that was nearly as hilarious and strange as the things you see every day. In the last few weeks we saw Queensland decide not to dump dredge spoil in the Great Barrier Reef, and in fact to buy back their own mud from the proponents of this project. I mean, except they didn't have enough money, so they've hit up the feds for the money to buy back their own mud. And I thought, if Utopia had screamed that, you just would have said, "Oh, that's ridiculous." So have you had to make the most far-fetched bits actually based on real stories, or have you been able to put in exceptionally great bits of fiction?
Sounds like a question to you.
Is that right? Okay. Well, look, as like the Chinese embassy was, I guess, an example where there is a great story there, and we were able to basically take that and essentially, turn it around a little bit, but use it as the basis for the opening for the book, and to use it also as this. When we were researching this book, we started looking at the whole issue of cyber espionage and what's going on there. And while we were researching it, we had a whole series of reports that came out. I don't know if you remember, but about 2.5 years ago, there was a big report by a US firm called Mandarin into alleged Chinese cyber espionage. And that essentially gave us the sort of platform or the first idea, if you like, in terms of the themes that we pursued. But then over the course of those next several months, we had the whole WikiLeaks and the whole NSA stuff and the whole Edward Snowden stuff playing out. The whole politics of that cyber espionage sort of turned on its head, and it went from China being the sort of the arch sort of evil to Washington and America, and the whole thing sort of turned on its head. So it was sort of quite extraordinary, and it was. So you find yourself in that sort of scenario where you're writing fiction, but you're able to draw upon some pretty extraordinary thing that's playing out in the real world, and you just got to basically sort of work out how to pull it all together and how to write it in a sort of dramatic landscape, if that makes sense. I mean, Canberra is already a dramatic landscape. You don't have to basically write anything too far-fetched to write a really fascinating, cracking story. There's some great stories that take place in this town. It's just that most of it is hidden from view. Most people see politics as what do you see on the 6 o'clock news? You see those 60 seconds from question time, etc. You don't see the drama and the intrigue and what's happening behind the scenes. And it's only when people bring out long form journalism or the occasional book that you get to read these fantastic stories. And you go, oh, that's sensational. I mean, we hark back to 75 and the whole CIA Whitlam conspiracy, Shades of 75, and we use that as a platform, as a theme to basically develop in the book and turn it around, and we give it a contemporary sort of edge. And you don't have to think too hard or refashion things too hard to draw that link between what was happening in 75 with the CIA and getting rid of Whitlam and Pine Gap and what's happening now with this extraordinary world that we live in, where we know that we're in Australia, every government is basically eavesdropping on each other. We're tapping the phones of the Indonesian president's wife, and the US are tapping Angela Merkel's mobile phone. I mean, that's all out there. It's not fiction. It's actually happening, but it's pretty extraordinary, and it makes for great material, great raw material to then fashion into a political novel.
Yeah, interestingly too, I saw that Peter Carey has actually decided, after an idea he said has been bubbling away for 3 decades, he's going to write a book on Whitlam's dismissal and the CIA's role in it, which is going to be fascinating. Thief.
That should be too.
Yeah.
Trouble coming up the back.
This book is a pretty outrageous attack on the People's Republic of China, our great trading partner. I just wonder if you authors, and I use the term loosely, have considered in any way the possible diplomatic and indeed economic fallout from such an outrageous attack on our biggest and most important trading partner, and the indeed racist overtones that are contained in this attack on China. I'd be very interested in your response.
That's the first serious question.
Turn that recorder on.
That's the first serious question I've heard you ask for years. Thank you, Ian, for that. That was only slightly provocative by your standards, mate. In all seriousness, I would argue that we have been quite nuanced in terms of our coverage of China and America. We certainly didn't set out with Mandarin Code to try and portray China as the baddie, so to speak. In fact, and I know you're only being slightly provocative, but Chris?
Yeah, we thought of all those things and we're hoping they were going to ban it in China. In which case then, we'd get a bit of publicity. That was really all we were after, cheap publicity. Which you would know, understandably. The
cheap part, anyway.
Yeah, the cheap part, anything. But I would say that if you look at the Chinese leadership, they come out a whole lot better than the US leadership, where we've got a sort of guy who's controlled by Tea Party Republicans and doesn't seem to be all that bright, who stumbles into this situation which the Chinese have been hoping for because they want to have the opportunity to prove that there's new power on the rise. So I take your question seriously. I try to treat it seriously, but really it's a joke.
I didn't know you're an apologist for Beijing either. It's quite interesting, mate. But it is interesting. Sorry, just on that. I mean, I reckon, China is such a great, fantastic story. I mean, and I'm by no means a Chinese expert, but I've had a bit to do with the National Press Club over the years. I'm on the board of the Press Club, and every time, the most complaints about our speakers have always come from China. Whenever we've had the Dalai Lama, they have kicked up a huge stink. There was a time when a Chinese minister was going to speak at the Press Club, and the guy came a couple of days beforehand. Someone from the Chinese embassy came through, and there was a photo of the Dalai Lama on our sort of honour board, and it demanded that photo be taken down. We will not have the Dalai Lama, and it's sort of like, and we told them to get knotted, and I think we leaked the story to the Australian in the process. But China is this extraordinary thing where it does try and basically control everything, and I find it an endlessly fascinating story, and we've. China tries to throw its weight around. I mean, of course, all countries do, but China does it in a way that I find quite extraordinary.
The most recent example is Stephen McDonald's story on Foreign Correspondent last week, where the Chinese met with the ABC's management, because it was on the Uyghurs, and said there would be kind of unspecified consequences for us proceeding with this story. So even within Australia, they push their weight around a lot, and they're not hard to upset.
Chris, I'm aware that we're probably coming up to your bedtime, so I'll try and keep it brief. You mentioned some of the events in the book. Some of the strangest ones come from fact. Did you two create any fictional events or characters that you thought might have been too over the top for the book, that didn't make the cut, that you perhaps regret or might feature in an upcoming book? Or did your best ideas come from truth?
I think some of the best ones certainly did come from truth. A lot of it was inspired by truth, and we tended to twist it round just a little bit. Look, you know, I can't imagine that there has ever been a bondage session between a female Liberal leader and a journalist. Couldn't happen.
Sorry, the female Liberal leader bit?
Yeah, that's the part that couldn't happen. Yeah. It's never going to happen. We've got to get the cabinet first. But so yeah, look, you know, obviously there are huge parts of the book which are sheer invention, and one of the liberating parts of it is that, you know, when you're working in your day job, you've got to get someone to confirm that something actually happened, and this you can just make it up. So what happened next? Oh well, we'll just make it up. And but it's really interesting sort of plotting your way through this, and I've got to say, in this one, which was much more complicated for us, that, you know, the idea was to try and work out a story arc that would sort of maintain a level of interest. And you can get lost in it. Like, I found that a few times where you get to the point you think, I just cannot see where we go, even though we'd written it down. You think, no, that's not going to work now. So we have to change things. And then you have to go back and rewrite earlier bits to make sure it all kind of meshes together.
Yeah. That's part of that's the challenge and the magic of basically writing a novel, that you've got to somehow, from the first page to the last page, the whole story has to hang together, and you've got to basically make and you've got to reconcile a whole lot of sorry, that's probably me. You have to reconcile a whole lot of different stories towards the end, and that is a challenge, but makes for fairly interesting.
All right, probably got time for one more question.
Sorry about my cough.
With all your experience with News Corporation,
yep.
Steve, how difficult was it to get an ABC journalist to write fiction?
I like it. Well, when I started the Mandarin Code, I was employed by Uncle Rupert, and about halfway through writing it, I left. So it was, and there's our journo, who is a News Limited journalist, works for the Australian, who I think it's fair to say doesn't come out of the book all that well. No. So it was sort of quite an interesting sort of process to write it. Yeah, it was. Thank you for the question. It was quite a liberating experience.
We have both been accused of doing fiction as in our day jobs as well.
Oh, yeah, often. I was often accused of it. Yeah.
All right, I'm gonna wrap up with one last one. My colleague Dave Richardson was actually a consultant when The Hollow Men was being made.
Oh,
They actually took the research tasks sort of sufficiently seriously that they engaged Dave and a range of people to actually give them plausible policy scenarios that they could then sort of, deconstruct, so to speak. And I think The Hollow Men was brilliant television.
Yeah.
Personally, I love the thick of it. We haven't swapped notes on the thick of it, Steve. We'll have to do that. But if you haven't watched it, as long as you don't mind a lot of swearing, I'd encourage you to watch it. I love it. I really enjoyed recently House of Cards, but I'm just going to out myself here. I always found West Wing tedious. Look, Chris can't believe it. Too many kind of smart people walking around having interesting conversations in hallways, and no one was screaming at anybody. So I guess, most people who don't work in Parliament House never see how brutal, messy, ugly, and at times surprising politics can be. Fiction gives us, or satire gives us, one kind of insight into that. But to both of you, I assume you've seen the thick of it as well, Chris, and perhaps you've seen House of Cards. Can any fiction even hold a candle to the full brutal horror of A-grade politics in full flight?
Probably not.
Well, just there are constantly extraordinary stories. Like, I'm imagining in the next book a populist fat politician from Queensland. Stay with me here. I don't know the reason. Former property developer. Former property developer.
A woman.
Who?
Sorry.
Chloe. Who combines forces with a former chief of staff from the Greens to work on environmental policy.
No.
And then that let up on a roll. A former US president, a vice president. No, because president will work. Former US vice president comes out and endorses the policy in a joint press conference, broadcast live around the Senate. And the following day, the former Greens chief of staff is seen photographed coming out of the Senate with Clive Palmer. Oh, sorry.
You mean
You couldn't make that stuff up.
No.
You could. No.
Oh, dear. But you do. I mean, I can remember over the years your former boss Natasha Stoddard-Spohr. I can remember the night that. I mean, one of the things that remains with me is ringing Natasha up after being told by John Cherry, one of the Gang of Four. This is, when Natasha was Democrats leader. I think a really good leader of the Democrats. She had a problem. She kept watching over her shoulder, but she was a really good leader.
Poorly advised.
I didn't want to say that. But I can remember basically ringing her up to tell her that you're about to be shafted by 4 of your colleagues, a Gang of Four: John Cherry, Andrew Murray, Aidan Ridgway, and one other, Lynn Allison. And she had absolutely no idea. And of course, the next day she basically resigned. And it's those sorts of moments. You remember those moments, like the leadership. I mean, Chris broke the story about Rudd being rolled by Gillard in June 2010. I mean, that, you look back at that, modern politics, it is just extraordinary what is actually taking place. The brutality of it is just is quite extraordinary, and we only get to see a tiny part. That's one of the reasons I think Paul Kelly's Triumph and Demise book is a cut above most of the non-fiction that's around, because he's actually got people to speak out and actually give their side of the story, and to actually try to chronicle what's actually happened in politics, rather than just having a single person perspective, albeit from those on the inside.
Yeah. And the things that happen, and this is why I love being in journalism, because you never know what's going to happen from day to day. And with the whole Rudd being rolled for Gillard thing, I was between jobs. We were setting up 24. It hadn't been established yet. We didn't get it up until the second week of the election. If I'd still been on the 7 p.m. news at 5 o'clock that night, I wouldn't have been down at Aussie's having a cup of coffee. It's a fluke. Someone from the Labor Party, senior Labor Party figure, says, "Do you want to have a cup of coffee with me?" Fine. So that's not unusual. Sit down. I remember it vividly because the Prime Minister's chief of staff. No, it wasn't him. The Prime Minister's press sec was at the next table. So sitting at Aussie's, and we're having a cup of coffee. One sip in, this guy leans forward and says conspiratorially, "Could we win with Julia?" And I said, "I didn't think that was an option anymore." And then he got up and left. His coffee's not drunk. And I thought, that's unusual. And simply, that starts as happenstance. And I go upstairs and start ringing people, and no one will pick up their phone. And then finally, one of the faceless men picks up the phone, and I say, "What's going on?" And he says, "What do you know?" And I said, "I know something's going on." And he said, "Call me back after 8 p.m. and I'll give you an exclusive." And I said, as the phone was hung up, "But the news goes at 7. But so that's the extraordinary thing. Or I remember vividly the day that, in the middle of the Godwin Gretsch stuff, as it started to unwind, having been involved. Steve and I got together, really, because he did the story on Godwin Gretsch on a Friday, I did the Monday one. And the Monday one was from a call from an ACT, copper. So, it says, "That guy Godwin Gretsch, yeah?" I said, "We're on our way up to his place now. Turns out to be some kind of mad liberal."
I wish you'd told me before. We're selling copies, by the way, of the Mandarin Code. We're very happy to sign them for you as well. But we don't.
Unfortunately, we don't have. They're $25 each, and we don't have any change, and we can't do cards. So,
well, on that, I can help you out. And by the way, I do encourage you to buy the book. I think, both of them, in fact. I think that Canberra is a fantastic place, and it's interesting that more and more people are writing about it and describing it. And for people like myself that are interested in policy and politics, I think the more people have more understanding of how it's done and whether fiction and satire, well, do they have a role to play? Of course they do, and from such well-informed sources, I think it's a great contribution. So yeah, look, I do. I was going to give you a plug for the book. You beat me to it.
Sorry,
there,
mate.
Steve. No,
I've got a sign to
but similarly, brought to you by. But look, if people would like to buy the book and don't have cash on them tonight, if they just want to leave their name and their phone number, we can sort that out somehow. So
very happy to.
But please all join me in thanking Chris and Steve.